Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now, let's dive into the stories. It was a cold winter evening when Mark found himself driving down a desolate stretch of road, the kind of road that seemed to disappear into the endless snowstorm. His car's headlights barely cut through the thick blanket of snowflakes, and the tires slipped on the icy surface, making every turn feel precarious. He had taken this route many times before, but tonight, something felt different. The weather had worsened quickly, and the usual signs of life, passing cars, distant houses, were nowhere to be seen. It felt as if the world around him had frozen in time. Mark, who was used to driving at night, had always found comfort in the solitude, but tonight the silence felt oppressive, almost suffocating. As he drove, his phone rang, its sudden chime startling him. He glanced at the screen, no caller ID. With a shrug, he answered, half expecting a telemarketer. "Hello," he said, his voice breaking the silence. The voice on the other end was quiet, strained. "Mark. You need to stop." He froze. It was his sister, Laura, but something in her tone made him uneasy. "What's going on?" he asked, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "I don't know how to explain this, but—" "You're not alone on the road," she said, her voice trembling. "Get off it. Turn around. Now." Mark was confused. He had driven this way hundreds of times without issue. "What do you mean? There's nobody here." "Mark, listen to me," Laura interrupted. "Look out your window." He glanced out the driver's side window, half expecting to see the blurred outline of trees or an oncoming vehicle. But there was nothing. Just the swirling snow, as if the world had been erased. Yet, in the corner of his eye, he thought he saw something move. Suddenly, there was a loud thump against the side of the car, followed by a scraping sound, like something dragging across the metal. Mark's heart raced. He slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the shoulder, the car skidding as he struggled to regain control. The wind howled outside, drowning out all other sounds. His breath quickened, fogging up the window as he tried to peer into the darkness. Nothing. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, the world beyond his car now a ghostly blur. He exhaled shakily, telling himself it was just the storm playing tricks on him. Then, just as he was about to drive off again, he heard it, faint but unmistakable, a whisper, coming from the back seat. "Get out." Mark's blood ran cold. The car was empty. He hadn't seen anyone since he'd been driving. With his heart pounding in his chest, he slowly turned his head toward the rearview mirror. The reflection showed nothing but the dim interior of his car. But in the silence, it felt like someone, or something, was watching him from the darkness. His phone buzzed again, jolting him out of his trance. He picked it up quickly, desperate to hear Laura's voice again. "Mark, do not open the door," she screamed through the line. "It's not safe. Get back to the nearest town. Now." But it was too late. The temperature inside the car dropped dramatically. He could see his breath misting in the air. A shadow, tall and thin, appeared outside the windshield, standing still in the snowstorm. Its eyes glowed faintly, cold and empty. With every ounce of strength he had, Mark turned the key in the ignition and slammed his foot on the accelerator. The car surged forward, the tires slipping on the icy road, but the figure remained in his rearview mirror, its form never changing. Mark didn't look back again. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of a small town miles away, his hands still shaking. As he parked the car, he glanced around, half expecting to see that shadow looming in the distance. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the winter night, with only the sound of his heavy breathing in the car. He never took that road again. It was the middle of December when Sarah drove through the snow-covered mountain pass, her car's headlights barely cutting through the thick blanket of falling snow. The storm had come out of nowhere, and the road had quickly become treacherous. Her phone had no signal, and there were no other cars in sight. She had taken this route many times before, but tonight, it felt different. The wind howled as the snowflakes swirled around her, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Sarah could feel her anxiety growing with every mile. She had hoped to reach the small cabin her family had rented for the holidays, but the snow was relentless. And the road seemed to stretch on forever. Suddenly, she noticed something in the distance. A light. At first, she thought it was another car, but as she drew closer, she realized it was a single cabin, its windows glowing warmly in the night. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. Maybe she could stop there and wait out the storm, at least until help arrived. She pulled her car into the driveway, the crunch of the snow beneath her tires the only sound in the otherwise quiet night. As she got out, she could see the cabin clearly. It looked old, with a porch wrapped in snow, the chimney releasing a thin stream of smoke into the cold air. There was a light on inside, but no sign of life. Sarah knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She knocked again, harder this time, but still, nothing. Just as she was about to leave, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman standing in the doorway. Her hair was white, her face wrinkled, and her eyes seemed almost empty. "Can I help you, dear?" the woman asked, her voice raspy. "I'm sorry to bother you," Sarah said, "but my car broke down, and I was hoping to get some shelter from the storm." The woman stepped aside, motioning for Sarah to come in. "Of course, come in. The storm's worse than you think. You can stay for the night." Relieved, Sarah entered the cabin. It was dimly lit, with a fire crackling in the hearth. The warmth was a welcome change from the bitter cold outside. She sat down on the couch, looking around. The place felt strange. Old, certainly, but something about it felt off. "Thank you," Sarah said. "I didn't think I'd find anyone out here." The woman didn't respond. Instead, she moved quietly around the room, as though preparing for something. After a moment, she sat down across from Sarah, her cold, lifeless eyes never leaving her. The silence in the cabin seemed to grow, oppressive and thick. Sarah tried to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up her spine, but the longer she stayed, the more uncomfortable she became. The woman was still staring at her, unmoving. The fire crackled in the background, but the warmth it provided was no longer enough to calm Sarah's nerves. I should probably call someone," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. But when she glanced at the screen, she realized there was no signal. "Don't worry, dear," the woman said, her voice suddenly softer, almost too soft. "You won't be leaving tonight." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She stood up abruptly, but her legs felt heavy, as though the very air around her was weighing her down. The woman stood slowly, her movements unnaturally stiff. "I've been waiting for someone like you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll stay with me now. Forever." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as the woman's figure seemed to distort, her face growing pale and hollow, like a mask. The warmth of the fire was suddenly gone, replaced by an icy draft that swept through the room. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, and Sarah realized, with a growing sense of horror, that the cabin wasn't empty. It never had been. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the cabin. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. Her breath quickened as she backed away from the woman, who now stood eerily still in the middle of the room, her eyes fixed on Sarah with an unsettling intensity. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. She tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to surge through her. The woman's lips curled into a slow, almost imperceptible smile. "You don't need to leave. You're safe here with me." The temperature in the room seemed to drop further, the cold creeping up Sarah's spine. She glanced around, desperate for some kind of escape. The window on the far side of the room seemed like the only option, but it was small, and she wasn't sure it would open. I need to go," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I'll be fine. Please, just let me go." The woman didn't respond at first. Instead, she stepped forward, her feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Sarah's pulse raced as she instinctively took a step back, but the woman reached out a cold, bony hand, brushing against Sarah's arm. "Listen to me, dear," the woman whispered, her voice taking on a strange, almost hypnotic quality. "It's too late for you to leave now. You've already come too far." Sarah's mind raced. There had to be some way out of this. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she couldn't stay here. The woman's grip tightened on her arm, pulling her back toward the center of the room. "No," Sarah said, her voice shaky but firm. She yanked her arm free and stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. I don't want to stay here. I don't. The woman's expression darkened. Her once calm demeanor shifted into something more menacing. You don't have a choice, she said, her voice now cold and commanding. There's no way out. Not for you. Not anymore. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around Sarah, the room feeling smaller, suffocating. The wind howled outside, but it felt miles away. The door was locked. The windows sealed. She was trapped. Her thoughts raced. What could she do? What was the woman's game? Sarah tried to focus, to think clearly, but fear had clouded her judgment. The woman was right about one thing: it was too late to turn back. She needed to find a way to survive. In a split-second decision, Sarah lunged for the fireplace poker lying by the hearth. She didn't know what she was going to do with it, but it was the only weapon she could reach. She swung it at the woman, hoping to create some distance. To her shock, the woman didn't flinch. The poker passed right through her, as though she wasn't even real. Sarah froze in horror. The woman was. Wasn't she? But then she heard it, soft whispers, like 1,000 voices murmuring from every direction. She turned toward the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The room was alive with noise, overwhelming and terrifying. It felt as though the house itself was speaking to her, warning her, calling her to stay. Sarah's breathing became shallow, her body trembling. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she knew one thing: she couldn't stay here any longer. Desperation flooded her senses. She rushed toward the window, pounding on it with her fists. The glass didn't break. It was like the cabin itself was holding her prisoner. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, urging her to stay. The wind outside screamed like a warning, but Sarah didn't care anymore. With one last, frantic attempt, Sarah pulled at the window again, harder this time. It gave way slightly, enough for her to wedge her hands between the frame and the glass. She pushed, her heart racing with every ounce of strength she had left. Finally, with a sharp crack, the window gave way, and she crawled through it, her clothes ripping on the jagged edges as she tumbled into the snow. She didn't look back. Gasping for air, Sarah ran as fast as she could, not caring where the path led. The cabin behind her seemed to fade into the darkness, but the cold gnawed at her, relentless. As she stumbled through the snow, her mind kept replaying the woman's words, "You don't have a choice." But Sarah didn't stop. She wouldn't let that cabin or whatever dark force it contained claim her. Somehow, against all odds, she made it to the road, and a passing car saw her, stopping to help. She never spoke of that night again. But she never forgot. The haunting whispers, the woman's cold, lifeless eyes, they stayed with her, in the back of her mind, every winter since. And sometimes, when the snow fell heavily, and the wind howled just the right way, Sarah could almost hear them again. Sarah's heart still raced as the car sped away, the headlights cutting through the endless stretch of snow. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, not daring to look back at the cabin or the shadowy figure that had haunted her every step. The driver, a man in his late 30s, glanced over at her, concern evident on his face. "You okay?" he asked, his voice warm compared to the cold air outside. She nodded, too exhausted to speak. Every inch of her body screamed to get as far away from that place as possible. She wanted to forget. She needed to forget. The car drove for what felt like hours, the storm outside showing no signs of letting up. It wasn't until they reached the small town that Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe, to relax even just a little. The man pulled into a gas station, and Sarah thanked him quietly before stepping out of the car. She glanced around, trying to shake the sense of dread that had followed her all the way here. The wind howled, but for the first time that night, it didn't feel as suffocating. She pulled out her phone, hoping to call her family, but the signal still didn't come through. Frustration built in her chest. She wanted to talk to someone, anyone, who could help her make sense of what had happened. Was it real? Was she losing her mind? Need a place to stay? The man's voice interrupted her thoughts. The hotel down the road has a few rooms. It's too late to be out here, especially with this weather. She hesitated, but nodded. Yeah. I think I need to rest. She followed him to the small, dimly lit hotel, where she paid for a room and made her way to the second floor. The door clicked shut behind her, the lock turning with a reassuring click. But even as she sank into the bed, her mind wouldn't quiet. She kept seeing the woman's hollow eyes. Hearing the whispers, even now, in the back of her mind. You don't have a choice. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her body tense as she slowly stood up, her hand shaking as it reached for the door handle. When she opened it, the man from the car was standing there, his expression strange, like he knew something she didn't. "You forgot your jacket," he said, holding out the worn coat she had left in the back seat. Sarah's eyes widened. He had followed her. But before she could respond, his face twisted into something unrecognizable, a sinister smile spreading across his features. The hotel room seemed to grow colder, the walls closing in. The man's eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, Sarah could see it, the same emptiness she had seen in the woman back at the cabin. "Don't worry, Sarah," the man said, his voice now low and guttural. "You'll never leave. You're exactly where you need to be." The door slammed shut behind her before she could react. The warmth of the room, the safety she thought she had found, vanished in an instant. The whispers returned, louder this time, and she realized with horror that they were coming from inside her head. She couldn't escape. Not anymore. And that was when Sarah understood, the nightmare she had fled from hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The old logging road wound through a dense forest, the towering pines dusted with fresh snow. Peter tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his rusted pickup truck, the tires crunching over the icy ground. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 7:12 p.m. He had been driving for hours, his only company the dim glow of his headlights and the occasional groan of the engine. Peter was a delivery driver for a local supply company, tasked with bringing a generator to a remote lodge deep in the woods. He had done jobs like this before, but the storm brewing outside was unlike anything he had ever seen. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the truck slightly with each gust. Ahead, the road split. Peter squinted at the old wooden signpost, barely readable through the swirling snow. One arrow pointed to Birch Creek Lodge, the other to Maple Hollow Camp. He knew the lodge was his destination, but the sign looked wrong. The arrows misaligned as if someone had tampered with them. A chill ran down his spine, but he brushed it off. The road grew narrower as he drove, the snow deeper, nearly reaching the bumper of his truck. The trees seemed to press closer, their dark branches clawing at the edges of the headlights. His GPS had stopped working miles ago, leaving him to rely on his instincts and the fading memory of the lodge's directions. After what felt like an eternity, Peter spotted a faint light ahead. His shoulders sagged in relief. The lodge. But as he drew closer, the light didn't look like a welcoming porch lantern, it was a fire, small and contained, flickering in the middle of the road. Peter stopped the truck, his breath visible in the cold air. He rolled down the window slightly, calling out into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. He hesitated. The fire looked deliberate, almost like a signal. But the area was supposed to be deserted, no guests were expected at the lodge this time of year. Curiosity won over caution. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the biting cold, the snow crunching under his boots. As he approached the fire, he saw something strange. A piece of cloth, torn and charred, lay near the flames. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve. "Hey!" he called again, louder this time. "If you need help, I'm here." The forest answered with silence, except for the wind whistling through the branches. Peter's instinct screamed at him to get back in the truck, but before he could move, he noticed something else, tracks in the snow. They were faint but unmistakable, footprints leading away from the fire and into the trees. His mind raced. Should he follow them? What if someone was injured or lost? He couldn't just leave. Shining his flashlight on the tracks, Peter decided to follow them, calling out as he went. "I'm here to help. Are you okay?" The footprints led deeper into the forest, weaving between the towering pines. Peter's heart pounded as he walked, the cold biting at his face and hands. He had gone no more than 50 yards when the tracks abruptly stopped. "What the?" he muttered, shining his flashlight in all directions. The snow was untouched around him, pristine and unbroken. It was as if whoever made the tracks had vanished into thin air. Suddenly, the wind picked up, and Peter thought he heard something, a faint voice carried on the breeze. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but it was there. "Help. Me." The voice sent a chill down his spine. It sounded close but directionless, echoing through the forest. Peter spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Where are you?" No answer. Then he heard it again, clearer this time. "Help! Me!" It came from behind him. He turned, his flashlight trembling in his hand, and froze. Standing just beyond the beam of light was a figure. It was barely visible, its outline blending with the shadows of the trees. But its presence was undeniable. Peter stepped back, his voice catching in his throat. Who are you?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and unmoving, its form distorted by the swirling snow. The voice came again, but this time it didn't sound faint or far away. It sounded as though it was right behind him. "Help me!" Peter whipped around, his flashlight revealing nothing but empty snow. When he turned back, the figure was gone. The fire he had left behind suddenly flared, its light illuminating the forest in an eerie glow. Peter felt a surge of panic as the whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing around him. He turned and ran, stumbling through the snow, desperate to get back to his truck. But when he reached the road, the fire was gone. And so was his truck. Peter stood in the clearing, his breath clouding the icy air as he scanned the space where his truck had been. The tracks it had left in the snow were gone, as if it had never existed. The fire, the strange figure in the woods, and now this, it was too much. His pulse thundered in his ears as he weighed his options. Walking back was impossible, he had no idea how far he'd driven or even if he'd taken the right road. The forest was thick, the storm unrelenting. But standing still wasn't an option either. The whispers began again, faint and disjointed, like the forest itself was alive and speaking to him. "Keep moving. Don't stop." Peter shivered, clutching his flashlight tighter. His only hope was to find the lodge, the original destination. Maybe someone there could help. He turned and started walking down what he thought was the road, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The trees pressed closer as he moved, their branches heavy with ice and snow. The light from his flashlight seemed weaker now, the darkness swallowing it before it could reach too far ahead. The whispers followed him, growing louder with every step. "Turn back. Too late now. You shouldn't have come." Peter shook his head, trying to focus. "It's just the wind," he muttered, though even he didn't believe it. A sudden crack echoed through the forest, a branch breaking, maybe. He spun around, the flashlight beam shaking as it swept the area. Nothing. But the sound had been close. Too close. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. No response, only the wind and the faint rustle of snow falling from branches. He turned back toward the road, or what he thought was the road. The snow had covered everything, erasing any sign of where he'd come from. He kept moving, his pace quickening as panic set in. Then, up ahead, he saw it. A light, faint but steady, glowing through the trees. Relief surged through him. The lodge. It had to be the lodge. Peter broke into a jog, ignoring the whispers that seemed to rise in protest. As he drew closer, the light resolved into a single lantern hanging from a crooked post. Beneath it stood a small building. Not the lodge he had been sent to, but an old cabin, its windows dark and its wooden frame weathered by time. He hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. Something about the cabin felt wrong. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently with the wind. "Hello," he called out, his voice tentative. "Is anyone in there?" The forest seemed to hold its breath. No answer came. Peter stepped closer, the snow crunching underfoot the only sound. As he reached the porch, he saw tracks in the snow, boot prints leading into the cabin. They looked fresh. He leaned into the doorway, shining his flashlight inside. The interior was sparse, a small table, a few chairs, a wood-burning stove. On the table sat a single object, a pair of keys. His heart leapt. Could they be for his truck? He stepped inside cautiously, the floor creaking under his weight. The cabin was bitterly cold, and the air smelled faintly of smoke, as though a fire had been extinguished long ago. He picked up the keys, turning them over in his hand. They looked like his truck keys, but before he could celebrate, he noticed something else, a sheet of paper lying beneath the keys. Scrawled across it in uneven handwriting were 3 words. "Don't trust them." The door slammed shut behind him. Peter whipped around, his flashlight beam cutting through the sudden darkness. The whispers were back, louder and more insistent than ever, rising into a chaotic chorus. The temperature in the room plummeted, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps. The walls of the cabin seemed to warp, the shadows growing darker, deeper, alive. A voice, clearer than the whispers, spoke from the corner of the room. "You shouldn't have taken those keys." Peter's flashlight flickered, the beam dancing wildly before going out entirely. He was plunged into darkness. And then he felt it, a cold hand gripping his shoulder. Peter froze, his body paralyzed by the icy grip on his shoulder. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick with an unnatural chill. He wanted to turn, to see what was behind him, but his legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The grip tightened, and then a voice, low, guttural, and impossibly close, whispered in his ear. "You took what wasn't yours." Peter spun around, his flashlight flickering back to life in his trembling hand. The beam illuminated. Nothing. The cabin was empty, yet the weight of a presence lingered, oppressive and suffocating. He clutched the keys tightly, his heart pounding. Whatever was happening, he needed to get out. Now. Peter bolted for the door, wrenching it open with a force that nearly pulled it off its hinges. The storm greeted him with a howl, snow swirling in chaotic spirals. He didn't care where the road was anymore, he just ran, his boots slipping on the icy ground as he plunged into the forest. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more distinct, as if the trees themselves were speaking. "Wrong way. You can't escape. It's too late." Peter pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged bursts, until he saw something through the haze of snow, his truck. It was parked in the middle of a clearing, its engine idling, warm exhaust billowing into the frigid air. He stumbled toward it, half laughing, half crying with relief. Fumbling with the keys, he yanked the door open and climbed inside. The cabin lights flickered as he slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. "Thank God," he muttered, turning the heat up and gripping the steering wheel as though it could anchor him to reality. But as the warmth filled the cabin, Peter's relief turned to unease. The windshield was fogged from the heat, but through the mist, he saw movement. Shadows flitted between the trees, circling the truck. He wiped the fog from the glass with his sleeve, squinting into the storm. His stomach dropped. The figures weren't just shadows, they were people. Or what used to be people. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, their faces twisted into expressions of anger and despair. They surrounded the truck, motionless, staring at him. Peter slammed the truck into reverse, tires spinning as they fought for traction on the snow-covered ground. The figures didn't move, even as the truck lurched backward. He threw it into drive, the headlights cutting through the storm. The figures parted just enough for him to pass, their heads turning to follow him as he sped away. The road appeared ahead, and Peter gripped the wheel tightly, focusing on escape. But as the truck roared forward, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. It was the same person he had seen in the forest earlier, standing still, their hollow eyes locked onto his. Peter swerved, the truck skidding wildly before crashing into a snowbank. The impact jarred him, but he was alive. The engine sputtered, then died. Silence. Peter groaned, reaching for the keys to restart the engine, but his hand froze midair. In the rearview mirror, he saw the figure sitting in the back seat, their hollow eyes reflecting his own terror. "You can't leave," the figure said softly. "Not until you've finished what you started." The whispers rose again, louder and louder, until they were all he could hear. The world outside the truck dissolved into darkness, and Peter realized, with dawning horror, that he hadn't escaped the forest at all. He had never left. And he never would.